Well, thank you everyone for joining our press briefing. We're a couple minutes for while we load up the presentation, but I just wanted to welcome everybody and thank you for coming to this media briefing on what we're calling Missing Mobilities on resilience in the informal or popular transport sector. These are the minibuses, the 2- and 3-wheelers that are dominating the public transport and most transport trips in many low and middle income countries. You also see these forms of transport in developing economies, or developed economies too, such as New York. We call them the dollar vans. So they're not something that are unique to low and middle income countries, but a form of transport we see all over the world. But they are predominant in many low and middle income countries. If you travel to Africa or Southeast Asia, you'll see the minibuses that are providing basically the backbone of urban mobility in these cities. So we're here to launch today a paper that we're doing as part of a Volvo Research and Educational Foundation's project called PRISM, which is the Partnership for Research on Informal and Shared Mobility. As part of this, we're looking at key global issues to highlight within the informal and popular transport sector. And we have a great group of panelists to talk and experts to talk a little bit more about this after I discuss or present some of the key findings from the report. So I'm going to get right into it because I know we only have a limited time. But for the media that are here, I think if you are from geographies that are where popular transport, as we call it, popular because it's the form of transport that is most used among the public. And if you are from one of those countries, these issues will resonate with you. And it's something that is not fairly enough covered by transport officials, nor by in the sort of mainstream of how things go, although it's in the culture of what is happening. So I'm from World Resources Institute. We are a global organization with offices across the world and in different cities, especially where we see popular transport playing a role. Offices in Ethiopia, Kenya, Mexico, Rwanda, Brazil, and I'm located in our Washington, D.C. global office. This is a new briefing. I mentioned it's called Missing Mobilities, the Popular Transport Gap in Climate Adaptation. I'm going to share this QR code later, but we both have a link and a QR code here to the PRISM website. Again, PRISM is a VREF-funded project on research in informal and shared mobility, housed at Columbia University with Jacqueline Klopp here. Dr. Jacqueline Klopp to talk more about who's leading this, to talk more about that. So what we're trying to do is highlight missing mobilities, things that aren't getting enough attention on the global landscape regarding sustainable transport. One thing we identified was the missing attention to resilience. I don't know if anybody saw about a year ago the horrible floods that were happening in Kenya and in Nairobi, or the floods that were happening in Rio Grande do Sul in the south of Brazil, or annually the floods that happen with monsoons in Indian cities. But transport, if there's anything happening like that, transport is incredibly impacted, and that's why popular transport is also so important, because it's the way that most people move. Just highlighting some of the key findings from the report. We looked at something like 7 cities across the world and their climate mitigation and adaptation strategies or plans. And we found that there's a missing element here for adapting and resilience in the sector of popular transport. One of the key findings is that we need to see both mitigation and adaptation to climate risks incorporated into our transport planning and implementation. This briefing looks at how popular transport faces growing risks, particularly from extreme heat and flooding. I'll get into some of the key issues faced in the popular transport sector from this, but the sector faces essentially what we call a policy invisibility. If you do see people talk about it, policymakers particularly often talk about getting rid of these modes of transport and not a practical approach for how to improve them, how to incorporate them, how to integrate them into planning and implementation of transport projects. We also did a brief scan of international agendas and the local climate plans in the 7 cities I mentioned, and to which these plans address popular transport. I'll get into that. And our main takeaway, I think, is not just about resilience, but about the sector in general, and that's that these should not be merely looked as deficit-based systems, things that are problems, or things that we just need to get rid of, but systems that are solutions that bring ways for us to engage, and that they are actually assets to transport, providing access to opportunities and jobs, health services, education for people in cities across the world. Just as a conceptual framework that we have of this sort of overlap of the hazards of vulnerability and exposure, I'll get into heat in the next slide, but basically you take heat, you have a hazard there of urban heat. It's a rising issue in cities globally with temperatures rising, especially in the global south. You have a vulnerability at play. People in popular transport, let's say the minibus taxis in Accra, Ghana, people where you have, you can have extreme heat or flooding, and then you have exposure because people are in those commute times, just like another issue like air pollution. People take 45 minutes, 60 minutes, an hour and a half or even more to get to their jobs, to get to school, to get to where they need to go. And they're exposed to this risk and hazard during that time. So just two of the key issues we looked at. One was heat impact. I know it's a little hard to read this slide, but we identified some key public infrastructure needs. You have, with heat, a lack of infrastructure like shading structures, bus shelters for one, because of the informality of minibus systems, for example. You lack formal bus stops. I'm not talking about, bus rapid transit or light rail transit or metro where you have formal, built stations and the like, but even just basic bus stops where you have a bus shelter in place, you have areas for sitting. Those are often missing from these systems and could be implemented with sort of basic investments. You also see some risks to users. Heat is a particular problem with older populations, vulnerable populations that cannot be exposed to higher temperatures for longer periods of time. And as we're seeing rising temperatures, this is becoming an even bigger issue. Flooding impact too. I mentioned the floods from Nairobi. If you Google, Nairobi, Matatu flooding, you're gonna see some pretty harrowing pictures or videos from people on TikTok or YouTube looking at Matatus flooding with people in them being washed away. You see pictures like this here where you have 2- and 3-wheelers sort of mixed up with bus traffic. And this is big issue, particularly as we're looking at electrification of the transport sector, having electric 2- and 3-wheelers. There's a big concern about the viability, resilience of vehicles within this kind of environment. So again, we see major infrastructure issues, a lack of water retention on major transport corridors results in key flooding where people are traversing in these modes that are different than, say, a larger public transport bus or a metro that may be above ground. You have particular issues on transport roadways that need to be addressed with these systems that most people are using. We did look at climate action plans in 7 cities. These 7 cities are also overlapping with the PRISM project, where we have a living lab research, what we call living labs, but it's essentially research into how the informal sector is functioning in those cities. So we looked at climate action plans from these cities, and we found that informal transport is largely absent from them entirely. We did a review, too, of nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement, which also found national plans kind of lack any reference to informal transport. Even this is the way that most people move in many, many cities across the world. That said, there were mentions in a few. I think we found one in particular in Accra, Ghana, where the informal transport sector was acknowledged. But often that's about mitigation, and it will reference, say, to electrifying 2- and 3-wheelers or electrifying transport. And there's some maybe mention of mitigation in a broad kind of way, but no specific mitigation measures for the informal sector. And certainly we did not find any ways of addressing resilience or adaptation with regards to this part of the transport sector in those climate action plans. So for a mode of transport that is the predominant way people move, this is why we're saying we have a missing mobility in place in cities. So what can we do about solutions? First of all, we think we need to enable inclusion of the sector, the operators of these systems, the workers in these systems, the users of public transport in these systems. We need to hear from them. We need to have their meaningful participation into what kind of things we can do to improve, particular during extreme weather events. We need to have better data and planning on such systems. We and other partners have a project called Digital Transport for Africa, where we're seeking to increase the data on where public transport goes and where it stops with regards to informal transport, because often these systems, there's no knowledge on them at all, any data on where they go. If you look here in Leipzig, you see on the map in Google where public transport goes, where it stops, when the next train is even coming. That's the total opposite in many places where we don't have any kind of data tracking those systems. So if we have better data, we can develop better solutions. And then, of course, expanding urban resilience, incorporating informal transport into adaptation and resilience planning, incorporating into mitigation measures in cities so that informal transport is accounted for. We're going to be covering this in a more detail, where Jackie is going to be speaking on Thursday at a research session from 3:30 till 5 on the 22nd of May. That's tomorrow, Thursday. And I hope some of you, if you're interested in this more, you'll get a better glimpse of some of the research we're doing. So thank you again, and I'm going to leave this QR code up here and the picture of this great taxi, I think, from Mumbai. If you've ever ridden in those in Mumbai, they're great. So And then I'm going to sort of go to our panel now and just hear some reflections on the informal transport sector. And we have, right now, it's 12:18. We have till about 12:45. So we'll hear about 5 minutes from each of our panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions in this short media briefing. So I want to thank you all for coming. It's great to see. And first, I'll start off with Josephine Macharia. She is with the International Transport Forum. Josephine, I think you can introduce yourself, but we're glad to have you here because you helped convene a ITF expert forum on the informal sector and the issuance of a report on this subject, and we're curious to hear some of your thoughts and observations. So Josephine, go ahead. And I'm going to move over here while we shift to the panel.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben, for that very insightful presentation. My name is Josephine Macharia. I'm a policy analyst at the ITF. I work on a range of topics mostly related to urban mobility. And today I'll just highlight some of the key findings from a recent report that the ITF issued on informal transport and its externalities. As Ben mentioned, this was the result of a roundtable discussion that was held in Chile last year. And we had a range of experts participating, and it was hosted by our presidency country. So it was really great discussions arose from this roundtable, and you can find the report on the ITF website. Just briefly touching on what we found. So when we are discussing informal transport, we're really referring to a wide range of privately organized and operated public transport services. So these can include various modes, whether it's motorcycle taxis or shared ride services or minibuses and even buses in some contexts. So there's already extensive work characterizing these services, so we didn't really focus on that with this roundtable. The main thing we were focusing on is informality as it relates to the involvement of public authorities in the planning and delivering of these services. That is the relationship between public authorities and the services and the service providers. And we think that that's really what creates this idea of informality in transport. Importantly, we just want to note that limited public authority involvement does not mean that the sector is not regulated. In a lot of places, actually, pretty much everywhere the service operates, there are some kinds of regulations in place, and often they're related to whether it's entry to the market, through licensing, and in some cases, regulations even on where the services operate. But still, the persistence of this concept of informality really reflects two things, we think, which is either gaps in those kinds of regulations, and more importantly, lack of adequate investment in public transport services to meet demand. That is, informal transport services are services that often are filling gaps, whether it's in demand, whether it's spatial gaps in coverage. But because they're privately organized, they're not really obligated to operate where it's not profitable for them. This can mean that existing spatial inequalities are not addressed or are perpetuated in a lot of cases. And often, some of their operating practices can even lead to poor working conditions for the people in the sector, the people working in the sector, and risky behavior just because of competition for the market. So from our perspective, authority involvement to address these negative externalities, but also to take advantage of the asset to mobility that informal transport provides, should not be limited to regulation. It can and should involve various ways of engaging directly with the sector, whether this is in the form of setting service obligations in terms of where services can operate. Maybe it's related to fares and fare subsidies, or even vehicle requirements, as has been mentioned, to try and transition fleets to cleaner vehicles. But essentially, we propose that more direct engagement with service providers and including them in mobility planning processes can help for investments in transport to go further in all of these contexts. So all of the investments that you make in your transport system can go further if you're working with these service providers who are already meeting a demand that is in place, that exists, and serves a lot of people. And I'll leave it there.
Great. And folks can access that report on the ITF website. That's right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And what's the title of it, in case people want to Google it?
It's incorporating informal transport in mobility planning processes. Kind of a mouthful, but if you Google ITF and informal transport, it should be at least one of the early results.
Thank you, Josephine. Benji de la Peña, do you want to introduce yourself and representing the global...
I refuse to introduce myself. I'm just yes. I'm Benjamin de la Peña, or Benji de la Peña. I'm the CEO of the Shared Use Mobility Center that's based in Chicago and LA. The Global Network for Popular Transportation is our project, and we've been working at it for the last 5 years. And when we started it, it was really to elevate attention to these systems. When we started, there was no sense of how big these systems are globally. By our own kind of rough estimates, they move about 68 to 70% of all trips globally. The size of these fleets are huge. For instance, South Africa has 290,000 minibus taxis, and they carry about 80% of all public and shared trips. Lagos has 75,000 danfos. So imagine if you were a transit agency and you had to procure 75,000 vehicles, what size of investment would that be? Apart from that, the smaller cities and the mid-tier cities mostly have 98% of their transportation served by what we call popular transportation. So since we started, we've been working on this intersection of popular transportation, particularly with the implications of climate change. I remember 5 years ago, ADB hosted an online, this was during the pandemic, consultation on resilient transportation, and there were probably 50 or so people on the call, and they were talking about resilient transportation projects. Most of it was bus rapid transit, which was still planned, or light rail, which was still planned, and they were going to be lucky if they could be implemented in 10 years. No one was talking about the two-wheelers, the three-wheelers, the four-wheelers, the jeepneys, the matatus, and all of that. So part of our work has been elevating attention to this. We did the first chapter on informal transportation for the global status report that SLOCAT publishes on transportation. And now there's a whole chapter, the next issue will have that too. And it has a broader scope, right? First, when we wrote about it, was like this, it was what was missing. But there's work that's being done to collect these things now. We developed a template for the NDCs with the help of Transport for Cairo, so that the NDC stewards can then incorporate popular transportation into their programs. We're doing that work with SLOCAT and UITP. We are a member and co-organizer of PRISM, and we take the side of taking the research and spreading it to policy and practitioners. And so one of the things we like to say is, three things we like to say. First, it started with data, and Slum Dwellers International likes to say, being counted is the first act of inclusion. And so getting the numbers on these things, not only just the number of vehicles, but also the number of people working and the size of the economy. And these are huge parts of the economy and are completely ignored, right? But we make, most national governments will make very, very big investments in big infrastructure and hope that the popular transportation will adjust to it. So there's a lot of work to be done on both adaptation. Ben mentioned a lot of it. One of the things we like to say, again, is that we have to think of them first as SMEs. They are businesses. And so the logic of their resilience and adaptation has to be connected to whether their business is thriving or not. They are inherently resilient because if you're running a large transit agency and there's a major event, usually that shuts down and you're trying to get your hierarchy to respond to it. They will respond to what they can do because they need to for earnings, right? And also the people who need to get to their businesses. If you visit the Viennese Biennale this year, there is an exhibit by MIT called the Atlas of Popular Transportation. So that's, again, elevating transportation. And really, we're only beginning to see with these networks of research, networks of practitioners and policymakers on what is the climate action, how do we get to a just transition for this invisible This is Jackie's words. Invisible in policy, but very visible on the street. And Jackie, Dr. Klopp coined the term popular transportation, by the way.
Thanks, Benji. What was the number from Nigeria? For how many danfos?
In Lagos, it's 75,000 danfos. And those are the smaller four-wheeler yellow buses. I think the Malues have kind of eased away.
Right. And I think it's interesting too. If you look in Lagos, there's been an expansion of public transport in the city, which is great. But as in other cities in Africa, say in Dar es Salaam, where BRT has been introduced, which has been another great implementation, you still see the predominant amount of trips happening with popular transport. Is that correct? Where you see the predominance of trips still in popular transport, even when cities are making investments into other rapid transit projects that are quite prominent in the news and with policy?
Absolutely. You take Mexico City, right? It has formal, we don't like the term, formal transportation because you have to define it. There was a researcher in, I think it was Chile, who said, researcher in Peru, who suggested we should call it institutional transport, meaning there's a large institution behind it. Mexico City has rail, BRT, very good BRT, trams. I think they also have the gondolas now. But the last research that UCL had, and this is a little dated, 5 years ago, was 70% of all movement was through informal transportation or popular transportation. So they exist. And the big investments sometimes disrupt it, but they continue to serve. You look at the experience of South Africa, they've been trying to build bus rapid transit systems for the last decade. They built 2, and yet the majority of trips are still taken, even in those routes, through minibus taxis. Now, that is not to say that these systems have no problems. We don't want to minimize that. But we do also like to say that what we need to do is solve the problems of popular transportation rather than treating it as a problem, right? So it's how do you improve it? How do we make it better for users and for the operators?
Thanks, Benji. Jacqueline Klopp from Columbia University Climate School and the Center for Sustainable Urban Development. You can introduce yourself better than I can, I think. But Jackie, you're leading up the Partnership for Research and Informal Shared Mobility that is funded by Volvo Research and Educational Foundations, but you've also been integral to raising the profile of the informal sector, of minibuses. I think you were sort of one of the first to help literally put these services or public transport on the map in terms of the matatus in Nairobi. Do you want to give us some insights on this resilience issue in particular, but also how does that relate vis-a-vis to the recognition and incorporation of the informal, of the popular transport sector into planning and projects for cities?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So just first a word about the Partnership for Research on Informal and Shared Mobility. I think it was very visionary of the Volvo Research and Education Foundations to recognize the need for research and outreach and support of what they call next generation scholars around this issue of informal and shared mobility, which, as my colleagues have said, are these diverse forms of shared mobility. The global north, often these, ride-hailing companies, and minivans also that look like some of the ones in the global south but have maybe more technology associated with them that we're trying to use to kind of get folks out of the car. But these forms are ubiquitous in the global south, as my colleagues have said. But we know very little about them because they have been neglected in our plans, in our investments, our strategies around transportation. And you should just note from the very beginning that that is a profound justice and equity issue, because large numbers of people are relying on these forms of transportation. And so we built this partnership across 7 different cities in the Global South to do very engaged research on different aspects of these kinds of critical transport modes. And we took a living lab approach where we worked, as you've already heard, with the sector that we're looking at. So for example, colleagues in Bangkok at Chulalongkorn University, who are a key partner, are working with the motorcycle taxi sector, which is very, very critical for that city, which has often very narrow little roads where buses couldn't even go. So it becomes an essential form of transportation. Also, emergencies, you're in congestion, it's very possible to get a motorcycle taxi to take you somewhere. So, they're very, very engaged working directly with these operators. And that is one of our themes of PRISM, is to do this kind of work that also sees these forms of transportation as more than just transportation. As Benji said, they are little businesses. They're little businesses that employ a lot of people, and they also enable a lot of people to do their work. So they get people to work, but they also get people to market, which are, again, providing critical services. So our living lab in Mumbai is looking at auto rickshaws connected to the rail in a peripheral area in Mumbai, looking at the way these auto rickshaws enable the metro to function. Because without that, people will take their metro stop, but they can't get home, they can't get to work, they can't get to places. So in effect, these auto rickshaws are an extension of the mass transit system that is critical. And yet, no investment, they're missing often in plans. And even what we found in the living lab in Mumbai was that the space had to be rented by the rail station, by the auto rickshaw unions and businesses. That's how excluded they are from even the physical organization of the city, despite their importance. The other key theme of our research is equity. Again, this is a huge equity and justice problem. These are the forms of transportation that the majority, and including the most vulnerable populations, as was mentioned, use, and yet they do not get the same attention and investment, even though we could do a massive improvement in people's livelihoods if we did this sort of focus on improving this kind of transport. So we have these living labs taking this 3E approach: equity, engagement, and ecosystem. So looking at all the different people who are involved in, making this work. And it goes even beyond the people working in the minibus or the auto rickshaw. It's the mechanics, the people who run the terminals, the people who feed the workers, and so forth. So that's the theme of this research. In 7 different cities, I've mentioned Mumbai, Bangkok, we have San Jose, Costa Rica, Bogota, and then we also, we have Cape Town and Accra, and also Kumasi. So, and we're really fostering South-South exchange and learning. So that's the project. But coming to climate, I have to thank a motorcycle taxi operator in Bangkok for this policy brief, because it was during the Living Lab where my colleagues from Chulalongkorn University were interviewing and talking to the motorcycle operators about electrification, which is the focus of their Living Lab. How do you get electrification of these systems? And they were like, well, this one driver was like, what's going to happen to the battery? We have huge floods in Bangkok. That battery is not going to survive. What's going to happen to the charging stations? And it was in that moment of having that conversation that it became very clear that there was a huge gap around adaptation that also impacted mitigation. And we can't look at these two things separately when we get to the ground and figure out how to implement things. So out of that, we started to ask more of these questions around, well, what are these plans for people like the motorcycle taxi folks in Bangkok? And it turns out that there are very few plans for these people, even though we are now talking about the climate crisis, and we know we're seeing increasing catastrophic flooding, we're seeing increasing heat, growing numbers of extreme heat days, like Ben was saying, and whole economies function by people operating, as Benji was saying, on these systems to make our economies and our people and our communities, especially the most vulnerable, because a lot of the folks who use these systems are in places that are most adversely affected. We are going to have to include this sector in adaptation and mitigation. And here we have a huge research gap that we need to keep working on. Since we don't know everything about these vehicles, where they go, what their fuel is, how many passengers, this enormous gap. How do we calculate their emissions? This is something ITF has tried to do, and I congratulate you for that. I don't know, Josephine, if you want to jump in and say what you found with an initial modeling. Yeah.
Sure. So this is our global urban mobility model that we tried to get an idea of how different types of vehicles contribute to emissions. And of course, this was a few years ago before we had our fleet model integrated into our urban mobility model. But we found that just by gradual improvement of these vehicles, or this vehicle fleet, which in a lot of contexts is quite old, a gradual improvement of these vehicles can reduce urban mobility emissions quite significantly, like an additional 4% over the reduction in other measures put together. So if you take into account this, the age of the vehicles and how much they're moving around the city and the types of powertrains that they're operating on, you can get significant emissions reductions if you even just get slightly newer vehicles, not just going all the way directly to electrification, but newer vehicles, less emitting vehicles already can be significant for cities.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just say that last point, that this is a missed opportunity. And I think that's one of the main themes of this policy brief, is that should we bring on this sector as partners? Should we be able to figure out like how we could mitigate these emissions with them, and also work on adaptation, simple things perhaps like having proper bus stops and shelters from the heat and access to water, something, again, the Bangkok team is working on, that we could really both protect ourselves and our societies better from these climate threats, as well as address the root of the problem better, because seeing these actors, these operators, and all the folks around this sector as allies in this struggle, we will go much farther. And I just want to say that this is a win-win-win situation. So if you improve these vehicles, the benefits you get from reduced air pollution, better road safety, potentially better working conditions with things not breaking down, and so forth, on top of the climate benefits, we get so many ways that we are going to improve our societies. So we should be leveraging this climate situation to make much better and livable cities that are equitable for all. And I think that we need to do a lot more work at this level of research and engagement and policy and action, so that we can get to those more livable and healthy and climate resilient cities. So I'll stop there.
Great. So we just have a few minutes left, so we can let in the next media briefing on time. Are there any questions? I don't know, we can take one or two if there are from anybody in the audience. Yeah, Pui, go ahead.
I think, first of all, you have to ask, why are they a tool during elections, right? Because it happens everywhere, right? And it is because they have unaddressed concerns that politicians will then like to wield. And then also because they're organized, right? They have the SACOs are well organized. And I think if you talk to the leaders of some of these SECOs who are leading the advanced thinking or at least move on it, they know that they have to adapt. But mostly governments expect them to upgrade their vehicles and services on their own. Meanwhile, their fares are either controlled, right, or where they can serve. I can tell you the number of cities and times that governments say, we're going to ban them. And that never happens. It also is tied to, that's why PRISM is doing research on ecosystems, right, is to power relationships and kind of, particularly in Kenya, but I would say everywhere else, also on the historical experience of where investments were put and whether they were put for the settlers, right, versus the people who are coming to serve the city. So your question, I'm not actually answering your question of how, because I think the answer to that question is, first we have to explore it. And then we can figure out how. There's some very, very interesting research in South Africa with Stellenbosch University that was looking at the electrification needs of the minibus taxis. And the behavior of minibus taxis and what they serve means it has to be a different charging model, right? It can't be the way you would charge your car where I park at night and then it's running because you have to keep it business going. But they discovered the way these vehicles stop, you could find situations to charge them through renewable energies like wind or solar in these places. So I think there are solutions to be found, but the first question is let's recognize them first as assets, and then we can figure out how to solve the problems.
Great. I think, does anybody want to make a final comment? Because we're pressed on time, but if you have like 30 seconds, go ahead.
I'll do my best to keep it brief. I think on balancing priorities, public authorities are doing this all the time, and it has been mentioned repeatedly, I think, in this discussion. It's really important to not think of these services as something to be replaced. You have to think about how you can work with them. So there's already an opportunity there for them to balance their investments to make sure that they're getting the most out of their investments, right? You have to invest in improving roads anyway. How can you improve roads to make sure that you're working with the users of these systems and you're incorporating the service providers? So if you want to get the most out of your investments, you have to actually involve these operators, and that's a big part of our report.
Great. I just want to thank the panel. I want to thank the attendees to this event. I want to encourage any media who are present, if they would like to speak to any of us, we're around at the conference or after this event. We also can help put you in touch with people in cities who are working in this sector more deeply in particular cities, so happy to make those connections. I'll just end on the fact that we put this report out. Josephine, you talked about the report from ITF. Benji and Jackie have talked about some of the research that's happening in this space. There's been a lot of acknowledgement in the past 5 to 7 years on the vital role that the popular transport is playing. We've seen that acknowledgement. I think to this answer to this question is we maybe haven't seen how policy makers are responding to the acknowledgement. Even institutions like the World Bank have put out publications on the myths and of the informal transport sector and how those might be addressed. But the solutions of how we address these aren't yet quite there. And I think solutions can go in a right or wrong direction when you get big time players involved, right? They can start to bring in solutions that might be not the best. So we need to bring in good solutions that are informed by people and transport users in the continent. And on that, I want to thank you all for coming, and we'll look till the next briefing. Thanks again, and take care. That's great.